On the night of October 8, 1871, the fire that would consume 3 1/3 square miles of Chicago began somewhere in the vicinity of the O'Leary barn on Decoded Street. This is in every account. What is also in every account, though stated so briefly that most readers move past it, is that the city's fire alarm telegraph network, the system of cast iron boxes bolted to street corners across the city that was supposed to transmit the location of a fire directly to the central dispatch office at the courthouse, did not function that night in the way it was designed to function. The alarm was delayed. The delay is attributed, in the standard history, to a series of human errors: a watchman who saw the fire but pulled the wrong box, a telegraph operator who received the signal and misread the location, a dispatcher who sent engines to the wrong street. The standard history treats this as a cascade of ordinary failures under extraordinary conditions, the kind of thing that happens when systems designed for routine emergencies encounter a catastrophic one. I treated it as a starting point, because the fire alarm telegraph network of 1871 Chicago was not a simple system, and the messages it transmitted that night were not simple messages. And the man who sat at the central receiving instrument in the courthouse during the first 2 hours of the fire left behind, in a place no one thought to look for 50 years, a record of what he actually received. His name was Matthias Drosch. He had been a telegraph operator for the Chicago Fire Department for 6 years before the 1871 fire, long enough to know the system's capabilities and limits better than anyone except the engineer who had designed it. He survived the fire. The courthouse where he worked burned, but Drosch got out, and he lived until 1922, dying in Milwaukee at the age of 79. He never published anything about the night of October 8th. He gave one newspaper interview in 1886, on the 15th anniversary of the fire, and in that interview he described the night in terms that matched the standard account almost exactly. The wrong box, the misread signal, the engine sent to the wrong address. He said nothing that contradicted the official version. And in 1922, 6 weeks before he died, he dictated a document to his granddaughter that contradicted almost all of it. I came to this through the granddaughter. Her name was Cecilia Drosch Hoped, and she was a school teacher in Racine, Wisconsin, who died in 1971, and whose papers were acquired by the Racine County Historical Society in the early 1980s, along with a collection of family documents that the Society cataloged under the general heading Drosch Family Papers, 1860s, 1970s. The catalog entry for the 1922 document describes it as a personal reminiscence, dictated by Matthias Drosch, concerning his experience during the Chicago fire. This description is accurate as far as it goes. What it does not convey is that the reminiscence spends its first 3 pages on the personal account, the courthouse, the heat, the decision to leave, and then spends its remaining 9 pages describing in precise technical detail what Matthias Drosch received on the courthouse telegraph instrument during the 2 hours before the building became untenable. It is not a personal reminiscence. It is a technical deposition. It is the account of a man who understood, after 50 years, that the standard version of what happened that night on the telegraph network was not the version his instrument had shown him, and who decided, 6 weeks before he died, that someone should know the difference. By the time you reach the end of what I am going to tell you, you will understand that the fire alarm telegraph messages that came into the Chicago courthouse on the night of October 8, 1871, were not the simple location signals that the system was designed to transmit, and that the standard history assumes were transmitted. Something else was in those messages. Something that Matthias Drosch sat with for 50 years and finally wrote down in a technical language precise enough that I have been able to verify much of what he describes against the engineering specifications of the 1871 Chicago fire alarm system. Specifications that survive, as it happens, in the records of the Gamewell Fire Alarm Telegraph Company, whose system Chicago had installed in 1865 and whose corporate archive was donated to the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in 1984. The specifications and the deposition, read against each other, describe a message that the system should not have been able to send. Consider what the Gamewell fire alarm telegraph system actually was, because most people who know the Chicago fire at all picture the signal boxes as simple devices, and the telegraph network as a simple pipe. It was not simple. The Gamewell system used a coded wheel mechanism in each street box, a physical device that, when the box handle was pulled, rotated a coded wheel past a contact point, transmitting a specific pattern of electrical pulses that identified the box's numerical designation to the central receiver. The central receiver in the courthouse printed these pulses onto a paper tape, the same way a Morse telegraph printed, and the operator read the box number from the tape and dispatched accordingly. The system could transmit box numbers. It could transmit, through a separate circuit, general alarm signals that did not correspond to specific box numbers. It could transmit, through a third circuit used primarily for maintenance and testing, what the Gamewell specifications called administrative signals, patterns reserved for communication between the central office and the system's maintenance personnel. Patterns that would never appear in ordinary operational use, and that an operator unfamiliar with the full specification would not recognize as distinct from a garbled or damaged transmission. Matthias Drosch was not unfamiliar with the full specification. He had been maintaining and operating the system for 6 years. He knew the administrative signal patterns. He knew them well enough to know, on the night of October 8th, that what was appearing on his tape during the first 2 hours of the fire was not a garbled ordinary transmission. It was administrative signal patterns, transmitted in a sequence he had never seen in 6 years of operation, and carrying, in the structure of the pattern itself, in the gaps and groupings of the pulses as they appeared on his tape, information he did not know how to decode. This is the part I keep returning to. Because Drosch was not a man who dramatized things. The 9 technical pages of his 1922 deposition are as dry as anything I have read in 20 years of archival work. He describes the tape output in precise terms. He gives pulse counts and gap durations in the unit the Gamewell system used, fractions of a second, measured by the speed of the paper drive. He gives the sequence of the patterns across the 2-hour window. He notes the points at which ordinary box signals appeared, the legitimate alarm transmissions from boxes actually pulled that night, and distinguishes them clearly from the administrative pattern sequences that were interleaved with them. He is not telling a ghost story. He is describing what his instrument showed him, in the same register he would have used to describe it in a professional report if he had ever been asked to write one. He was never asked. Nobody, in 50 years of anniversary articles and retrospective histories of the Chicago fire, ever asked Matthias Drosch what his instrument had actually shown him on the night of October 8th. They asked him what happened. He told them the standard version. The standard version was not what his instrument had shown. The Gamewell administrative signal specification is in the corporate archive at the Smithsonian. I have read it. The specification describes 18 distinct administrative signal patterns and their intended meanings. Signals for maintenance requests, for battery status reports, for line integrity checks, for the activation and deactivation of relay stations at specific points in the network. It describes these patterns in terms of pulse count and gap structure. I transcribed Drosch's pulse descriptions from his deposition and compared them against the specification. 11 of the 13 distinct patterns Drosh identifies in his 2-hour tape record correspond to Gamewell administrative signal patterns. They correspond precisely, not approximately, not in the way that garbled signals might accidentally resemble administrative patterns, but exactly, pulse for pulse, in the pattern structure the specification defines. The other 2 patterns Drosh describes do not correspond to any administrative pattern in the Gamewell specification. They do not correspond to any pattern in the specification at all. They are in the pulse gap range of the administrative system. They are using the administrative circuit, not the alarm circuit, but their specific structure is not in the 18 patterns the specification defines. And that is the part I keep returning to again, from a different direction. Because the Gamewell system, in its 1865 Chicago installation, had 18 administrative patterns. Drosh's tape showed 11 of those 18, in a sequence and combination that the specification does not describe as a legitimate operational procedure, plus 2 additional patterns the specification does not define. The system was transmitting in its administrative register, in patterns that were partly in the specification and partly not, in a sequence that had no documented operational meaning, for 2 hours on the night of the largest urban fire in American history. And Matthias Drosh, who understood enough of what he was seeing to know it was not garbled ordinary traffic, did not know enough, did not have whatever key or codebook or prior knowledge would have been required to decode what the patterns meant. He copied them onto his tape. He saved the tape, or portions of it, and describes their contents in the 1922 deposition with enough precision that I can partially reconstruct what was transmitted. And he sat with them for 50 years, telling the standard story to anyone who asked, because he understood that the standard story was what the moment required, and that the technical truth of what his instrument had shown him was a story that required a reader who did not yet exist. There is a second document. In the records of the Western Union Telegraph Company, which operated the commercial telegraph lines that ran alongside and, in several cases, in shared conduit with the Gamewell fire alarm lines in Chicago, there is an operational log from the night of October 8, 1871, that describes the status of the commercial telegraph network during the fire. The log was maintained by the Western Union night supervisor at the Chicago office and covers the period from approximately 9 in the evening through 4 in the morning, when the fire's advance made the office untenable. The log is a routine operational document, circuit status, traffic volume, line disruptions as the fire damaged infrastructure, and in an entry timed at 9:47 in the evening, approximately 2 hours after the fire started, and approximately 40 minutes before the courthouse began to burn, the night supervisor makes a notation that I found, when I read it after reading Drosh's deposition, difficult to interpret as routine. He writes that the fire alarm circuit sharing conduit with the Western Union trunk line on LaSalle Street is showing anomalous current signatures that are not consistent with either alarm traffic or standard administrative maintenance signals, and that he is logging the anomaly for the attention of the technical staff in the morning. He does not describe the current signatures further. He does not note them again. The technical staff did not examine them in the morning because the office was gone in the morning, and whatever records might have followed from the morning examination were consumed along with the office building. 2 men, 2 instruments, 2 separate notations of the same anomalous signal on the Chicago fire alarm telegraph network on the night of October 8th. One of them waited 50 years to fully describe what he had seen. The other logged it for the attention of staff who never arrived. Neither of them published anything. Neither of them appears in any account of the Chicago fire I have read. And the administrative signal patterns Drosh recorded, the ones that matched the Gamewell specification exactly, and the 2 that did not match anything in it, have not been identified as what they are by anyone who has worked in either of the two archives that hold the relevant documents. What the message actually said is not something I can tell you. I want to be precise about that, because precision is what distinguishes what I am describing from speculation. What I can tell you is what the documents show. The fire alarm telegraph network in Chicago on the night of October 8, 1871, transmitted patterns in its administrative register that were partly consistent with the Gamewell specification, and partly not. Two trained observers on two separate systems noted the anomaly contemporaneously. One of them described it in technical detail 50 years later, with enough precision to allow partial reconstruction. The partial reconstruction shows that the patterns were structured, not random, not garbled, and that the structure corresponded partly to a known system and partly to something that system's specification does not account for. I have not found the key. I have found the message. And the message was there, on the tape, on the night the city burned, being received by a man who did not have what he needed to understand it, and who spent 50 years deciding whether understanding it mattered enough to say what he had seen. He decided it did, 6 weeks before he died, and his granddaughter, who was 12 years old when she took down his dictation and who kept the document in a box for 49 years, decided the same thing when she donated her papers to a historical society in Racine, under a catalog description that does not tell you what is inside it. And before I tell you how broadly this pattern runs, I want to name one more thing the Drosch deposition contains that I have not yet described, because it is the detail that reframes everything that preceded it. On the final page of the 9 technical pages, after he has described the pulse patterns and their correspondence to the Gamewell specification and the 2 patterns that exceeded it, Drosch writes a single paragraph in a different register. Not technical, not professional, but personal. He writes that he has spent 50 years trying to determine who could have been transmitting on the administrative circuit that night and why, and that he has arrived at only one conclusion he can hold with any confidence: the transmission was not initiated from any of the street boxes, because the street boxes did not have access to the administrative circuit. It was not initiated from the central courthouse instrument, because he was at the central courthouse instrument and he did not initiate it. The administrative circuit had one other point of access: the Gamewell maintenance terminal, a portable instrument that the company's engineers carried when they made their periodic visits to the network, and that connected to the administrative circuit at any junction box in the system. Someone with a Gamewell maintenance terminal was on the network that night. Someone who was not Matthias Drosch, and was not any fire department operator, and was not any name that appears in the standard account of October 8th, 1871, was transmitting on the administrative circuit of the Chicago fire alarm telegraph while the city burned. This pattern runs through the telegraph history of the 19th century more broadly than the Chicago incident suggests. The Gamewell administrative signal system was installed in 37 American cities between 1865 and 1890. The administrative circuits of those systems were, in every case, specified and maintained by Gamewell personnel under contracts that gave the company's engineers access to the circuit at any time for what the contracts described as technical maintenance purposes. The maintenance access provisions are in the standard Gamewell municipal contract, a copy of which is in the Smithsonian Corporate Archive. What those contracts authorized, in precise language, was the ability to transmit signals on the administrative circuit without the knowledge or involvement of the municipal operator. Signals that would appear on the operator's tape but that the operator was not expected to decode, because the administrative signals were described in the contract as technical in nature and not requiring operational response. 37 cities. Administrative circuits with maintenance access provisions. Operators who received signals they were not expected to decode. between 1865 and 1890. What was lost in the courthouse on the night of October 8, 1871, beyond the building, beyond the records it held, beyond everything the fire consumed in those 3 1/3 square miles, was Matekius Drosch's paper tape. He describes it in his deposition. He took the tape from the instrument before he left the building, rolled it, put it in his coat pocket. He lost it in the chaos of the night, somewhere between the courthouse and the lake, where hundreds of thousands of people were gathering with whatever they had managed to carry. The tape is gone. What remains is his description of it, 12 pages in a box in Racine, under a catalog heading that calls it a personal reminiscence, in the handwriting of a 12-year-old girl, who kept it for 49 years because her grandfather had told her it was important, and she trusted him. She was right to trust him. The tape is gone, but the description is there. The Gamewell specification is there. The Western Union log is there. 2 patterns on the tape did not match anything in the specification. The message was structured, and Matthias Drosch, who understood the system well enough to know that what he was receiving was not garbled ordinary traffic, sat at his instrument for 2 hours on the night Chicago burned and received something he could not decode, and never forgot it, and spent 50 years waiting for someone to ask him the right question. Nobody did. He answered it anyway. If you know someone who has read everything written about the Chicago fire and still feels, at the end of it, that the first 2 hours are not fully accounted for, share this with them. The deposition exists. The specification exists. The Western Union log exists. Matthias Drosch received a message on the night of October 8, 1871, that the standard history has never examined. He described it in technical language precise enough to partially reconstruct. The reconstruction shows structure. And the question of what that structure was trying to say has been sitting in a box in Racine, Wisconsin, since 1922, waiting for someone who knew enough to ask.